Medecins Sans Frontieres is one of the biggest foreign aid agencies in the world. It brings vital medical supplies and clinicians to incredibly dangerous countries. But we've spoken to people who say some aid workers abused their power in the field and exploited vulnerable women.
There was a transactional nature to the relationships. It could have been that there was an exchange of money for sexual behaviour.
He said, "Oh, it's so easy to barter medication with these easy girls in Liberia." And I thought, what did he just say?
There was definitely an element of an abuse of power going on.
We have spent months talking to women who used to work at Medecins Sans Frontieres, and they've all told us very similar stories. We've heard accounts of endemic bullying, misogyny and sexism inside the organisation, and in some cases even the use of prostitutes in the field. The other thing they all had in common was an absolute fear about speaking out. The women we spoke to were terrified of being blacklisted. They said there was a huge crossover of staff in foreign aid agencies, and their life could become very difficult if they spoke to us. They were also worried about the safety of their colleagues out in the field. So for this reason, they've been filmed anonymously. MSF is also known as Doctors Without Borders. It has thousands of medics working overseas. But this investigation is not about the doctors or nurses. We're told it was some of the logistical staff who were abusing their power. We met a whistleblower in London. She told us what she saw when she was on a mission in Kenya.
So when I visited a field project, there was a senior member of staff who was bringing girls back to the MSF house. Obviously, I couldn't know for certain that they were having sexual relationships, but it was implicit that they were. These girls were very young and they were rumoured to be prostitutes. The security in Nairobi is quite high, so I remember thinking, wasn't this a risk to my security when people were staying overnight?
And did anyone challenge the men?
It was difficult for people to challenge him because he was quite senior.
We met another whistleblower in Europe. She asked us not to name the city. She told us a senior member of staff had said it was possible to barter sex for medication with women who were getting medical aid.
He said, "Oh, it's so easy," and said it as if it was nothing. "It's so easy to barter medication with these easy girls in Liberia." And I thought, what did he just say? He was suggesting lots of the young girls who had lost their parents to the Ebola crisis, that they would do anything sexual in exchange for medication.
So when you heard your boss use the phrase barter medication with girls, what did you think he meant by that?
Sex in exchange for medication.
And had he been there himself?
Yes, he had. In fact, he bragged about it quite a lot. To say it in front of 3 or 4 people who were there, and to say it to me very directly. What's this all about? Well, to be honest, I couldn't believe it.
It was impossible for us to verify this claim because the whistleblower was not in Liberia at the time. And when we put this to MSF, they said they needed more information to investigate. Another former employee who worked with HIV patients in Central Africa said the use of local sex workers was widespread.
There was this older colleague who actually moved a woman into the compound. He was in his 50s, she was a lot younger. It was pretty obvious that she was a prostitute, but he'd call her his girlfriend. And she'd spend night after night with him, and he even installed a piece of tarpaulin to give her some privacy if someone walked into the room. And it was so blatant and so widespread. I saw one of my colleagues, he was a much younger guy, and he'd gone into the toilet with a local prostitute. I knew her to talk to because she worked in one of the bars. She told me they'd had sex and that he'd paid her. They'd had sex.
She also said she felt sexually harassed by some of the men she worked with.
Then there was this other colleague of mine. He asked me out and I said no. And from that point forth, the atmosphere in the compound was toxic. He made my life miserable. And he also brought prostitutes back in front of me. And the worst bit came when I left for a few weeks, came back to my room and found used condoms that he'd told people he deliberately left behind. I felt sick.
She said she reported his behaviour to her boss in the field, but she was told she'd be fired if the pair of them didn't sort things out. Medecins Sans Frontieres has very strict rules about the abuse of power, especially when staff are working overseas. But we're told the reality can be very different out in the field.
I felt that with some of the older guys, there was definitely an abuse of power. They'd been there for a long time, took advantage of their exalted status as a Western aid worker. It was definitely a lifestyle for them, and you couldn't help feeling that they liked it because they had the opportunity to have relationships with women that they wouldn't have been able to have in their own country. It could have been that senior management wasn't aware of it, but there's definitely a feeling that certain men who behave in that predatory manner are seen as too big to fail.
But it isn't just in the field where women say they felt uncomfortable.
We had a Skype meeting with a partner at another NGO who was sitting on her bed, and they both kept telling her how sexy she was and saying, "Oh, you look so fantastic," asking her where her husband was, how much weight she'd lost. She was really embarrassed and tried to move on, but they persisted with this for about 15 minutes. And I was just thinking, when is this going to end? Another time, I was discussing a medical procedure done in an African country where the whole question of a woman's reproductive organs came up, and it was written in French. I said, "We're referring to the vagina." "Ooh, what is this?" So I said, "Really? You can't be serious." So I said it in French, and he just rubbed his hands and said, "Oh, how exciting." And I thought, okay, apparently I'm back at school and dealing with schoolboys.
Did you get a sense that this kind of harassment, as you call it, had been going on for a while?
I think it's endemic, and it's part of the institution.
We spoke to 8 separate sources in our investigation. Well, the accounts you've heard so far are in no way isolated at all. We've heard from other women inside MSF who describe the culture there as toxic. One of our sources, who worked in the Amsterdam office, was told that she was going to work in the department of the walking wombs. She said that was how her boss described the women who were about to go on maternity leave. She said she raised this with her line manager, but nothing was done, and if anyone did complain about their behaviour, they were called the broken dolls. Another source, again in the Amsterdam office, was asked on her very first day at work whether she fancied her boss. She said he then went on to comment about the size of her breasts. She did raise this with HR, but she said not much was done about it. She also said the atmosphere in the field was no different to the office. She was sent on missions to Africa and Asia, and then finally she quit. MSF told us they were sorry if any cases of harassment had not been dealt with properly. And they said they need to do more to improve the reporting system and make people feel safe enough to come forward. But this isn't the first time MSF have heard complaints like this. After the Oxfam scandal broke, they admitted they'd sacked 19 staff for sexual harassment last year alone. And we've also seen an internal report that shows they were looking at this issue back in 2016. The report showed a third of female employees they'd spoken to said they'd been touched inappropriately at work. The whistleblower in London thinks the culture is entrenched.
I saw a lot of people trying to cope with the stress and the psychological trauma of some of the things that they'd witnessed. There was a lot of drinking. There can be a certain type of person that works for MSF. They start off going into humanitarian work for the right reasons, but when they've done mission after mission, there comes a mission creep. And after a while, you'd find they'd stop behaving in a way that you'd expect a genuine humanitarian to behave.
MSF said they'd conducted a thorough review of their files and made informal inquiries, but they couldn't find any record of the claims against the London office. They said they were deeply saddened to hear the allegations, but they hoped that it might encourage more people to come forward.